It was nearly midnight in Chicago, and the kind of night when the city didn't just sparkle, it watched inside Luna di Vetro, where the walls glowed with golden light, and every glass was polished until it looked like still water. Grace Miller moved quietly between tables. She'd worked a double shift already. Her feet numb, her mind half asleep, but this job paid double. And double was survival. Her uniform was pressed, her hair pinned tight, her smile rehearsed. She had learned long ago that poise could be armor. Some of the guests spoke in voices so low, they sounded like secrets being traded. The kind of men who looked at the world and saw chess pieces instead of people. Grace didn't know who they were. She didn't care. All she knew was, if she could make it through this night, rent was covered, and her son could have new shoes that didn't squeak. In the back hallway, near the service door, sat Ellie, 9 years old. A second-hand book balanced on his knees. He wasn't supposed to be there. Children didn't belong in places built for money and menace, but Grace had no one to watch him. He promised to be quiet, and he always kept his promises. When she walked past him, he smiled up at her and whispered, "You're doing great, Mom." That tiny voice gave her the strength to walk back into the glittering storm. At the center table sat Dominic Caruso. The name whispered through Chicago like a rumor. People feared to believe. 40 years old. Impossibly calm. His suit dark as confession. He was the kind of man who didn't need to shout. Power bent toward him by instinct. No one at the table dared speak until he did. He listened more than he talked. Every movement was measured. Every smile earned. To outsiders, he was a businessman. To those who knew better, he was a dynasty wrapped in silence. Grace didn't recognize him at first. To her, he was just another guest, until she met his eyes. There was something in them she didn't expect. Not cruelty, not coldness, just exhaustion. A man who had lived too long in rooms where honesty was expensive. When she poured his wine, her hand trembled slightly. The crystal clinked. He noticed, but said nothing. He simply tilted the glass and murmured, "Thank you." 2 words that shouldn't have mattered, but did. From his corner, Ellie watched. He studied people the way other kids studied comic books, searching for heroes. Even in dangerous places. That's when he noticed the 3 men at the bar. They weren't dressed like the others. Their suits fit wrong. Their laughter sounded rehearsed. They spoke softly, switching between languages, the way magicians switch cards Italian to Korean to Russian and back again. To anyone else, it would have been meaningless noise. But Eli heard every word, as if they were whispering in English, directly into his ear. It was a gift he didn't understand. Something he had never told, even his mother, before the toast. One of them said, "Make it look like an accident. Poison in the champagne?" Eli's heartbeat quickened. He looked toward the table where his mother served plates of sea bass to men who didn't smile. At the head, Dominic Caruso lifted a glass of pale gold champagne. The boy froze. He didn't know who the man was, but he knew what was about to happen. He didn't think. He just moved. He ran from the shadows of the hallway into the glare of the chandeliers. His small hands reached the table just as Dominic raised his glass. With all the strength in his body, Eli shoved the man's arm aside. The champagne arced through the air like liquid fire. Shattering against the marble floor, the sound cut through the room like a gunshot. Every conversation stopped. Guards reached for weapons. One guest ducked beneath the table. Another shouted something in Italian. And in the chaos, a real gun fired a single crack that sent screams ricocheting off the glass walls. Grace's body reacted before her mind could. She dropped her tray and sprinted forward, scooping Eli into her arms, as if her life were attached to his heartbeat. When she looked up, she saw Dominic Caruso standing perfectly still. Behind him, 2 of his men had tackled the shooters. One was bleeding. The air smelled like smoke and spilled champagne. Dominic's gaze shifted to the boy, clinging to Grace's chest. His eyes were calculating first, then curious, then something softer. "Who told you?" he asked. Ellie's voice trembled. "No one. I heard them. In English, in every language." The boy whispered. Dominic studied him for a long moment. As if he were deciding whether to believe in miracles, Grace expected rage. Instead, he crouched until his eyes met Eli's. "Then you saved my life," he said quietly. He reached out his hand. Not to threaten, but to thank. The boy hesitated, then shook it, that simple touch. In the middle of chaos, rewrote the room. By the time police sirens echoed outside, the restaurant was a crime scene of shattered glass and whispered disbelief. Dominic's men handled the officials quickly, smoothing the story, keeping the truth buried. Grace sat in the corner, trembling, her uniform stained with wine. Ellie sat beside her, silent. Guilt and fear tangled on his small face. Dominic approached, coat folded over his arm. "You both need to come with me," he said. Grace's spine straightened. "No. We'll give our statements and go home." "There is no home tonight," he said. "Those men weren't random. Whoever sent them will come looking for the ones who stopped them. We didn't stop anyone," she argued. "We just got lucky." He shook his head. "There's no such thing as luck in my world." Grace looked around and saw the truth of it. 2 of the men at the bar, already gone. Escorted out before police arrived. The fear in the staff's eyes. The black sedan idling outside the window with its lights off. She turned to Eli. He was shaking. A dark car across the street flashed its headlights once then twice. Every instinct she had screamed that her life had just changed, whether she wanted it to or not. When she finally nodded, Dominic's expression softened. Not victory, but relief. He led them to the back door, where the air smelled like rain, and the city's pulse beat low and slow. A driver opened the door of a sleek black car. "Grosse hesitated. Why are you helping us?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because your son reminded me that not everyone in this city is broken." She wanted to say something sharp, something to keep distance between them, but instead she just whispered, "And what about you?" Dominic's eyes held hers. "I'm trying to find out." Eli tugged her sleeve. "Mum, please." So she stepped into the car, holding her son close as the door shut behind them. Outside, sirens faded. Inside, silence settled like a confession. That night, power met innocence. And for the first time in his life, Dominic Caruso wondered what it would feel like to be worthy of forgiveness. The car turned the corner, vanishing into the quiet streets of the city that never really slept. Behind them, shards of crystal still glittered on the floor of Luna di Vetro, and the echo of a boy's small voice still lingered in the air, the sound that had changed the course of every life it touched. The gates of Dominic Caruso's mansion opened like a jaw and closed like a sentence. Behind them, night had a different sound, quieter, as if the wind itself had learned to keep secrets. The house rose out of dark trees and floodlit stone, a place built by money and maintained by silence. Somewhere, a fountain whispered. Somewhere else, a camera blinked red and forgot to blink again. Grace and Eli stepped out of the car with the small, stiff movements of people who didn't know whether they were guests or prisoners. A man in a grey suit took their bags so light they made the luxury around them feel almost insulting. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon oil and expensive restraint. Marble floors, tall windows, a chandelier that looked like a constellation no one had named yet. "This is for safety," Grace told herself. But luxury has a way of disguising cages as rescue. She kept Eli close, one hand on his shoulder, as if proximity itself could be a shield. Dominic met them not with guards, but with a stillness that seemed almost careful. He had changed out of the armor of the night. No tie. Sleeves rolled to his forearms. A watch that had belonged to another man. He nodded to Eli first, and the boy nodded back. Because children understand sincerity faster than adults do. You'll have the East Suite, Dominic said to Grace. His voice even. Eli will have the room next to yours. There are locks on the inside. Use them if they help. She didn't thank him. Gratitude felt dangerous here. She just inclined her head and said, "We won't be long. You'll be safe." He answered, "That's the only measure that matters tonight. Safety." The word floated. Uncommitted. Like a bird that might not land. The first hours unfolded with the quiet choreography of people pretending normal. A tray appeared with soup and bread, and a pot of tea so hot, it fogged the silver lid. Il y était tout faste. Grace pretended not to notice. Dominic stood at the doorway, as if unwilling to trespass on the ordinary. Though it was his house, and nothing here could exist without his permission, when Eli's eyelids started to sink, Dominic asked, almost shyly, "Does he like stories?" "He likes the truth," Grace said. "But he'll take a story, when the truth is too heavy." Dominic smiled with the kind of sadness that belongs to men who have carried heavy things alone. "I have an old book," he said. Italian. The translation is imperfect, but the rhythm is good. So in a room the size of their entire apartment, under a lamp meant for reading contracts rather than fairy tales, Dominic read to a 9-year-old boy in lilting Italian, pausing to offer the soft English of a man who had learned to speak without giving anything away. Eli listened with an attention that made the air gentler. Grace watched from the doorway, arms folded, telling herself that caution and tenderness can exist at the same time. When the story ended, Dominic closed the book, like a promise. "Buonanotte," he said. Eli repeated it carefully. "Buonanotte." Perfect. Dominic said, and he meant it. The house slept, but not the way ordinary houses sleep. Here, night had tasks: patrol routes, camera checks, low voices on radios. Grace lay awake and listened to a security perimeter hum through the walls. She had once dreamed of a white picket fence and discovered that where some people built fences, other people built moats. She wondered which kept danger out and which kept it in. Morning came dressed in glass and sun. In the kitchen, someone had left a plate of pancakes shaped like clumsy hearts. Eli's face lit in a way that made Grace forgive whoever had tried. Dominic didn't appear until later, with a stack of emails in one hand and a quiet apology on his mouth for being late to breakfast in his own home. They fell into a rhythm that felt almost like reprieve. Grace did not trust it, but she allowed herself to breathe while it lasted. She helped in the kitchen because her hands knew work better than idleness. She wandered the garden with Eli, who listened to birds and named them incorrectly, but with conviction. She kept her phone near, her bag packed, a contingency folded beneath every moment like a note under a plate. Dominic, for his part, practiced restraint like a penance. He made no demands. He issued no rules. He did not ask questions that required someone to surrender dignity. Instead, there were small generosities. A toy car repaired with a tiny screwdriver. He fetched himself. A coat for Eli that actually fit. A seat pulled out for Grace at dinner. Not as a performance, but as a habit that remembered a world before his took its shape. At night, he read. Some evenings it was the same Italian book. Other nights, it was a thin volume of poems, whose lines moved through the room, like shy visitors who stayed when invited. Eli began to mimic the melody of the foreign syllables, learning the language, the way children learn love by proximity. It should have been enough to heal something. And in small ways, it did. But even the softest rooms in that house were built on hard foundations. The past, the network, the quiet economics of loyalty and fear. Grace saw it in the faces of the men who came and went. Deference that looked a little like worship and a lot like survival. She saw it in the way doors shut gently when Dominic entered a room. And in the way conversation paused, as if words towed a line they could not cross. It wasn't cruelty. It was calibration. One afternoon, while Grace stood in the doorway between the library and the hall, Eli tugged her sleeve and pointed toward the servants' corridor. Voices, in low Italian. A laugh that didn't match a friendly story. Another voice answering in a Spanish that sounded practiced and impatient. Eli tilted his head, listening. He did not look pleased. "They're talking about us," he whispered. "People always talk," Grace said. "They're not just talking," he insisted. "They're selling. The man with the scar on his neck. He's asking what our names are. And the other one says, there's a price." The world narrowed to the width of that hallway. Grace's mouth went dry. "Are you sure?" Eli's certainty arrived without arrogance. "Yes." She found Dominic in his study, standing at the window, as if he could will the grounds to confess their secrets. He turned when she entered, saw her face, and didn't ask her to start from the beginning. "Which one?" he asked. "The one with the scar," she said. "And the younger one from the kitchen." Eli heard. Dominic nodded once. His jaw tightened, not the way men tighten before a blow, but the way they do before a difficult kindness. "Pack a bag," he said. 15 minutes. We're leaving." "Leaving where?" "A place that has no history," he answered. "At least not the kind that follows you in cars." 15 minutes later, they were on the road. The city unfolding behind them like a story being rewritten. Asphalt gave way to 2-lane blacktop, then to a long ribbon of road that threaded through pine and stone. Grace watched the rearview mirror and tried to decide whether fear was louder in pursuit or in imagination. Beside her, Eli counted clouds and lost track, because the sky refused to hold still. They arrived at a lakeside lodge that did not look like a secret, as much as an apology. The paint on the porch steps had chipped in a way that implied memory rather than neglect. The key turned with a complaint that sounded relieved. "Whose is this?" Grace asked. "My father's," Dominic said. "And then mine. And then no one's." For a long time, inside, the rooms were small and honest. Wood worn by hands, not by polish. A kitchen that didn't know how to be a showroom. Windows that framed the lake, like a photograph of a calmer world. For the first time since the restaurant, Grace felt her lungs fill all the way. Simplicity replaced control. They cooked. Badly at first, and then better. Dominic burned garlic, and laughed at himself like a man who hadn't heard that laugh in years. Eli set forks in the wrong places and declared it a new system. And they accepted the rule of a child, because sometimes the most merciful government is the one with the softest laws. They walked by the water. They let the cold press color into their faces. At night, they traced constellations on the ceiling with the tips of their fingers and pretended to name them. On the third evening, while Grace dried plates and Dominic set them back carefully in their mismatched stacks, she asked, "How does a man like you end up reading bedtime stories instead of giving orders?" He considered the plate in his hand, as if it might offer a better answer than language. "Power," he said slowly, "was my inheritance. I never asked for it. But I learned to wear it like armor." "And did it fit?" she asked. "It fit so well, I forgot it was heavy," he admitted. He put the plate down and leaned against the counter. with the posture of someone who had just sat after a long march. My father died at a dinner like that one. He said, a toast. A glass. A moment when everyone pretended we were civilized. He lifted the flute, smiled at me, and closed his eyes for the last time. It wasn't the poison that killed him. Not exactly. It was the certainty that what he'd built would outlive him and own me. Grace's hands were still. I'm sorry, she said. And meant it. He looked up. Not for sympathy, but for understanding. I told myself I could be different. Then I wasn't. And then I stopped telling myself anything at all. Maybe it's time you learn to take it off, she said. The armor. He studied her. The way a thirsty man studies water to see if it's safe. What if what's underneath isn't good? Then you learn, she said simply. That's what decent men do. Silence settled. But it was kind. In it, something rearranged itself inside him. Like bones knitting after a break. Sometimes the hardest confession isn't what you've done. It's who you became to survive. Days collected small proofs that human beings can start again. Dominic taught Eli how to skip stones, and failed spectacularly, which delighted the boy and humbled the man. Grace showed Dominic how to dice onions without weeping, and then wept anyway. Surprised by tears that did not hurt, they lit a fire and sat close enough to feel warm without crowding the quiet. It could have stayed that way. If the past were gentleman enough to knock. It wasn't. The first warning was the old dog down the lane, who belonged to no one, and everyone. He barked at nothing, then at something, then stopped too abruptly. The second warning was the way the lake's surface trembled without wind. The third was the sound. All men learn to hear if they live long enough engines where engines don't belong. Dominic didn't say a word. He crossed the room and lifted Eli without asking permission from either mother or child. Cellar, he said to Grace. Now. She moved. Because instinct trumps doctrine. In the cellar, the air smelled like dust and old summers. She could hear her heart and Eli's. And for a terrible moment, she couldn't tell which was racing faster. Above them, glass broke in a language you don't need to translate. Men shouted. Footsteps scuffed wood. Somewhere, a body met a wall. Somewhere else, a man learned that loyalty bought on credit collects always. Eli's hand searched for hers in the dark. He'll come back, the boy whispered, as if he were telling her a fairy tale he needed to believe. When the noise ended, it ended like a sentence that had finally found its period. And then there were footsteps on the stairs that did not hurry. The door opened. Light from a single bulb drew a thin line across the concrete floor. Dominic stood there, breathing like a man who had fought the air as much as the enemy. Blood darkened his shirt at the shoulder. Another stain on his side suggested a graze. Not a grave. His eyes found them first, which told Grace everything she needed to know. He sat at the kitchen table, because some chairs, understand, when to hold a man up. Grace tore a sheet and pressed it against his shoulder. Her hands were steady until they weren't. And then they remembered how to be steady again. You shouldn't have to live in my world, he whispered. She smoothed the bandage and met his eyes, then build a new one. The sentence landed as lightly as a prayer, and as heavy as a vow. He exhaled. Not in pain, but in decision. Then he reached for his phone, with a hand that trembled only because it was tired of what it had been doing for years. He called his underboss. A voice answered that had carried his orders since the first time he spoke, like a man who expected to be obeyed. No retaliation, Dominic said, before the man could speak. No revenge. Nothing moves. Anyone who lifts a hand answers to me. There was a pause, long enough to measure a life. They shot at you, the voice argued softly. Not as defiance, but as ritual, I heard you, Dominic said, and I'm answering. This ends. If they come again, we defend. If they don't, we let the ground eat the blood already spilled, and we plant something better there. Boss, Dominic, he corrected. The name surprised them both. I said what I said. He hung up and leaned back. The house was quiet, in a way that felt earned. Snow outside shrugged itself thicker, over footprints and windowsills. Doing the old work, of covering what should not be kept, Grace rinsed her hands. The water ran pink, then clear. Eli stood at the doorway with the stiff dignity of a small knight who had wanted a wooden sword and instead inherited a world. Are we safe now? He asked. Dominic measured his answer. Because men like him have misused words long enough to know they must be repaired carefully. Safer, he said. And getting safer. They slept poorly and woke light. In the morning, the kitchen smelled like coffee and surrender. Not the kind that gives up, the kind that gives over. Dominic stood at the window, watching a bird hop across the snow as if weight were negotiable. Grace poured 2 mugs and handed him one. Their fingers touched. The contact was brief, and deciding, you meant it, she said, about no retaliation. I meant it, he said. I don't know how to live it yet, but I meant it. Learning is allowed, she said. Even for kings. He almost smiled. Especially for kings. The phone stayed quiet, as if the network were holding its breath. The men who had betrayed him lay still in the snow, or had run far enough that their names grew smaller inside his chest. The old rules knocked on the door, found it locked, and left. The new rule was simple: protect, without destroying. Choose without coercing. Love without owning. By afternoon, Eli had built a snowman with a crooked grin that looked like courage. Grace wrapped a scarf around its neck and declared him a resident. Dominic laughed, then winced, then laughed again, as if a wound had remembered. It could be a door. The sun slipped toward the trees. The day made the long, golden apology of winter light. In it, 3 people stood in front of a small lodge and tried on a different kind of life to see if it fit. It did. Imperfectly. Which is to say, honestly, later, as the fire clicked and settled, Dominic spoke quietly into the half-dark. No more blood for power. Say it again, Grace said. It did. And then, because some sentences must be spoken into the bones of a house, to make them true, he said it. A 3rd time, Eli looked up from the floor where he had drawn a map of the lake with crayons, and the kind of ambition that makes art brave. Can we stay, he asked. Just for a while. For a while. Dominic said. And then we'll see. Outside. Night returned to its first, better job holding the sky in place. Inside, a man who had inherited a war put down his weapons and picked up a life he hadn't known he was allowed to want. A woman who'd learned to distrust rescue found herself believing in it again, because it had learned new terms. And a boy who heard every language fell asleep to the only one that matters, in the end, peace. Spoken fluently. At last, 6 months passed. The world kept turning. As it always does, when stories end quietly. As if pretending it never noticed the people who changed inside it. By the edge of a lake 2 hours north of Chicago, sunlight fell across the windows of a small cafe called Second Chances. The smell of fresh bread and roasted beans filled the air. The name wasn't just a sign above the door. It was a prayer disguised as business. Grace Miller moved between tables with the same grace that had once carried trays through danger. Her apron was worn, her smile unguarded. The lines near her eyes weren't from fear anymore, they were from laughter. On the chalkboard by the counter, someone had written the day's special forgiveness pie. Sweet. Messy. And worth it. Most customers thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Eli was at school down the street. He liked it. They liked that nobody whispered. Liked that no one knew how extraordinary his ears were. He was learning ordinary things now: math, science, how to be a child again. Sometimes, Grace caught herself glancing toward the lake, searching the horizon for a ghost she wasn't sure would ever come back. The papers said Dominic Caruso had vanished after dissolving half his empire. Some said he was dead. Others said he'd fled to Europe. Grace never believed either story. Some people don't die or disappear. They just finally go quiet. It was a Thursday evening when the past returned in the sound of tires on gravel. A black car pulled up to the curb. No guard stepped out this time. No glass tinted enough to hide intent. When the door opened, Dominic emerged, dressed simply a grey sweater. No watch. No shadow trailing behind him. The man who once wore control like armor looked lighter now, as though he'd set down the world and found it didn't fall apart without him. Grace stood behind the counter, frozen for half a breath. He smiled, soft and real. "You kept your promise," he said, glancing at the cafe sign. "I did," she answered. "You look..." She stopped. Words like different or alive felt too small. "I look like someone learning to breathe again," he said. He placed a thin folder on the counter. Inside was a certificate with gold lettering, the Eli Miller Foundation. For what, Grace asked quietly. For him, Dominic said. And for every child who never got the choice to live outside men like me. It funds schools, language programs. Maybe even hope. Hesitated. Your son reminded me what I should have been protecting all along. Grace's eyes softened. You didn't owe us this. Dominic smiled. And for once, it wasn't weary. I don't owe anymore. I choose. The words hung between them like sunlight filtered through glass warm. Unhurried. Believable. The bell over the cafe door chimed again. And Eli burst in, breathless from running. "Mom, look." He held up a certificate covered in bright ink and gold stars. "I won the essay contest. They said I get to read it at the assembly." Grace knelt to see it. "That's wonderful. Honey." Eli turned to Dominic. "Grinweid. Not shy at all. Do you want to hear it?" Dominic looked at Grace for permission. She nodded once. Eli unfolded the paper, cleared his throat, and read in the solemn voice of a boy taking something sacred seriously. "My essay is called The Strongest Person I Know. Some people think strong means big or scary, but I think strong means kind. My mom is strong because she works hard. My friend Dominic is strong because he stopped being scared of peace. The world would be better if people like them ran it." He looked up, proud. "That's it?" Grace's eyes glistened. Dominic swallowed hard. The way men do when emotion reminds them they still have a pulse. He crouched to Eli's height. "That's my boy," he said before he could stop himself. Then he caught the word. "Too familiar. Too forward. Sorry. I meant..." Grace touched his arm gently. "You can say it." He smiled quiet. Humbled. "That's my boy." Eli grinned wider. Not because of what it meant, but because of how it felt like safety finally had a voice. As the evening settled, Grace closed the cafe early. They walked down to the dock, the wooden boards creaking beneath their steps. The lake held the sunset, like a secret. It had been saving all winter. Ellie ran ahead, skipping stones that barely kissed the surface before vanishing. Grace and Dominic followed behind. Two figures walking in rhythm, their shadows long and intertwined. Neither spoke for a while. Some silences are earned. Finally, Grace said, "Do you ever miss it? The power he considered the water before answering." Power was loud. Peace is quiet. I used to think silence meant weakness. Now I think it's strength that doesn't need witnesses. She smiled. You sound like someone I used to warn not to get himself killed. He laughed softly. The kind of laugh that comes from healed places. I used to think I was saving you that night, he said. Now I know it was the other way around. They reached the end of the dock. The lake shimmered gold. Then indigo. Then the color of forgiveness. Dominic rolled up his sleeve. A small tattoo marked his forearm Pax Amore. He traced the words with his thumb. Peace through love. He said, My father taught me that power keeps men alive. You and Eli taught me that love keeps them human. Grace looked at him for a long time. Eyes full of the kind of understanding that doesn't need translation. Then maybe that's your real inheritance, she said. And this time, it won't destroy you. He nodded. No. This time, it saves me. Some stories end with revenge. But the rare ones, the ones worth remembering, end with a man learning to protect without destroying. And a woman strong enough to believe he could. The camera of the mind pulls back 3 silhouettes, standing at the edge of the lake. A mother who believed again. A man reborn by grace. And a boy who once heard every language. Now teaching them both. The only one that mattered. Love. If this story moved you tonight, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Click like to help it reach others. Tell us in the comments which moment touched your heart the warning. The cabin? Or the walk by the lake? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where love finds light in the darkest places.